Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I want to talk about something that has been weighing on me for a while now. And honestly, it makes me a little sad every time I see it happening. If you spend any time online, especially on places like Reddit, you've probably seen posts labeled things like AITA, which stands for Am I the A-hole? Or WIBTA, Would I be the A-hole? People go online and describe situations in their marriages, their friendships, their families, and then thousands of strangers jump into the comments to give their opinions. Sometimes the stories are funny. Sometimes they're ridiculous, but very often they're heartbreaking. You see people who are clearly hurting, people who feel lonely in their marriages, people who feel misunderstood, people who feel like they're not being respected. And those struggles are real. Marriage can be difficult sometimes. Relationships are complicated. But what bothers me even more than the original story are the responses. Because it doesn't take long before the comments start flooding in with things like, divorce him, leave her, you deserve better, run. And I sit there reading those comments thinking, you people don't know this couple. You don't know their history. You don't know their marriage. You read a paragraph, maybe two, written by someone who is already emotional. And suddenly you're telling them to destroy a covenant, a marriage, something that affects families, children, entire futures. And it's happening more and more. We are living in a culture that encourages people to react quickly instead of think deeply. Marriage was never meant to be handled with quick reactions. Marriage has layers. Marriage has history. Marriage has wounds and healing and growth. And sometimes the story being told isn't even the whole story. Now, I want to be very clear about something before we go any further. Domestic violence is never acceptable. Not from a husband, not from a wife. And infidelity is a very serious betrayal. There are situations where separation or divorce becomes necessary for safety or protection. Those are real situations, and they deserve prayer, wisdom, counseling, and guidance. They should never be decided by strangers in a comment section. But that's not what I'm talking about today. What I'm talking about is the internet culture that jumps straight to destruction before anyone has even tried understanding. I recently saw a perfect example of this while watching a video from Charlotte Dobre. She reads Reddit posts and reacts to them. One story really stuck with me. There was a woman who had been married for 17 years. 17 years. And she was starting to worry that her husband might be cheating. But there was an important detail in their past Years earlier, they had actually gone to marriage counseling. And during that counseling, something had been discovered about her husband's personality. He had what they call damsel in distress problem. He had a habit of helping women. If a woman needed help, he would jump in. He wasn't flirting. He wasn't trying to start relationships. He simply had a personality where he felt compelled to help. But from the outside, it could look suspicious. So when this wife started noticing him helping women again, fear crept in. And when she posted about it online, you could probably guess what the comments said. Divorce him. He's cheating. Leave immediately. Even Charlotte initially leaned toward that interpretation. But this woman did something incredibly wise. Instead of listening to the internet, she talked to her husband. She sat down and had a real conversation. And do you know what happened? He was completely clueless. He had no idea that the pattern had started showing up again. Yeah. The moment she explained how it made her feel, he stopped immediately. He corrected the behavior and reassured her. The marriage was restored, not destroyed. And there was another detail about that story that really stood out to me. They had young children in a 17-year marriage. Now imagine if she had listened to the internet. Imagine if she had packed up and left because strangers told her to. A marriage that could be repaired would have been gone. A family would have been broken. Children would have been caught in the middle. All because thousands of people online reacted to a situation they didn't fully understand. Instead, she chose conversation. She chose wisdom. She chose to protect her marriage. And that decision protected her family. Now let's talk about something else that people misunderstand a lot. And that's marriage in the Bible. Some people read the Old Testament and see examples of polygamy and assume that God approved of it. But when you really study scripture and the historical context, something very different becomes clear. The Bible records what happened, but that doesn't mean God endorsed it. In fact, many of those stories show exactly how much chaos those arrangements created. Take Abraham, for example. Sarah and Hagar. Sarah gives Abraham her servant Hagar so they can have a child. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. Later, Sarah gives birth to Isaac. 2 sons, 2 lineages. Those lineages eventually grow into different peoples. And to this day, echoes of those ancient family divisions still exist in parts of the Middle East. What started as a family decision created ripple effects for generations. The Bible isn't celebrating that situation. It's showing the consequences of human choices. Then you look at Jacob, Leah and Rachel, 2 sisters competing for the same husband's affection. jealousy, pain, division. Again, the Bible records it. But it also shows the emotional damage. And then there's Solomon, hundreds of wives. And scripture actually tells us those relationships led his heart away from God. So when Jesus later talks about marriage, he does not point to those examples. He goes back to the beginning, Genesis, where the design was simple. One man, one woman, one covenant. In Matthew 19, Jesus says, "What God has joined together, let no one separate." Marriage is meant to be protected, not discarded the moment things become uncomfortable. Now, I want to share something that had a huge impact on my own marriage. Years ago, I used to listen to Dr. Laura Schlesinger on Sirius XM. And if you've ever heard her show, you know she does not sugarcoat things. Her advice is direct, sometimes uncomfortable, but it's rooted in wisdom. I eventually read her book called The Proper Care and Feeding of Husbands. And I'll tell you honestly, that book changed how I looked at marriage. One of the biggest lessons she teaches is that men are very physical creatures. They respond deeply to appreciation, to respect, to physical connection. When those basic needs are met, they thrive. And when they thrive, they pour that energy back into the marriage. When I changed my own outlook and started applying those principles, my marriage became incredibly strong, rock solid. And the beautiful part of that story is that my husband eventually chose to profess his faith in Jesus. Not because I forced it, but because he saw the example of faith in our home. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened through patience, through grace, through prayer. And that leads me to something I want to say specifically to women in midlife. Because the world sends a very confusing message right now. It tells women they must choose between independence and marriage, between strength and partnership, between personal growth and commitment. But that's a false choice. You can absolutely have a traditional marriage and still rock your midlife. In fact, midlife is often when marriages become the strongest. You have wisdom. You have lived through storms together. There's often less chaos from raising young children. And you finally have time to reconnect. For my husband and I, traveling together has been huge. We ride motorcycles together. Those miles on the road, those shared experiences, those long conversations, they have strengthened our relationship in ways I never expected. And during this stage of life, you also have more time to grow spiritually, more time in the Bible, more time praying, more time investing in the covenant you made. But strong marriages don't happen by accident. They happen through intentional choices, through patience, through prayer, through refusing to let culture define your relationship. Personally, when something is bothering me in my marriage or in life, the best thing I can do is take it to God first. I pray about it. I sleep on it. And very often the situation looks completely different the next day. Sometimes the problem resolves itself. Sometimes my perspective changes. Sometimes the answer is simply patience. But what I've learned over time is this: the internet rewards reaction, but wisdom requires reflection. So before you let strangers online tell you to destroy your marriage, pause. Pray. Seek counsel from people who actually know you, because sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't walking away from something broken. Sometimes it's watching God restore it. Now, I want to try something new with this podcast moving forward, because clearly there are many people out there struggling with real situations, marriage problems, family conflicts, friendship challenges, moments where you're not sure what the right decision is. So I'd like to invite you to share those situations with me privately. You can remain completely anonymous if you'd like. And in future episodes, I'll read some of those situations and offer thoughtful Christian guidance. Think of it a little bit like those "Am I the a-hole" posts, but with a foundation in faith, not reaction, not outrage, but prayerful wisdom. Because sometimes people don't need louder opinions. Sometimes what they really need is someone willing to slow down, look at the full picture, and respond with grace, discernment, and biblical perspective. So if you have a situation you'd like to share, something you're struggling with, something you'd like a Christian perspective on, you can send it to me privately. And together we'll work through it in future episodes. Because marriages, families, and relationships are too important to be decided by a comment section. And remember, before you listen to Reddit, pray first. And as always, Reddit is not your marriage.